Choosing names for your characters is honestly one of the most fun things that you can do while writing. So today I'm going to share with you my 5 top tips for how to choose names for your characters when you're writing modern or contemporary fiction. I write books set in our current world, and so my process of choosing names for my characters looks different than somebody who's writing fantasy or sci-fi. I'm not going to be talking about that at all. This one is focused only on contemporary fiction writing and how I personally like to choose names for my own characters. So there are 5 things that I consider when choosing names for my characters. I'm going to walk you through each of them in order, and then at the end share examples of different characters that I have named and why I chose those names, different mistakes that I've made, and how I've honed my process. The first thing I consider when choosing a name for one of my characters is setting. Both the setting of the book and also the setting around that particular character. By setting, I'm talking about the country that the character is from, the state in the US that character is from, the culture that that character is from. A lot of times, where somebody is from has a big influence on their name. Certain naming conventions are more popular in different places of the world. Different countries and cultures and languages have different naming customs, and certain names are more popular depending on where you are in the US even. It's important to understand the setting and context that your character exists in so that you can just start honing in on the type of name that your character would have. Information about common names in different parts of the world is pretty easy to find on the internet. You can Google it, you can ask ChatGPT to compile lists for you. One resource I really like using because I write fiction based in the United States is the Social Security website. It will give you a list of the top 100 most popular names by state and by birth year, and that gives me a place to start. I really like using those for filling out my extended cast in a certain place. I just finished writing a series set in Ohio, and I used that website to populate my extended cast. Not for my main cast of characters, but for people like the cook at the local restaurant or the postal worker at the post office. It's a super helpful resource, and I recommend going and checking it out if you don't use it already. The second thing that I consider when trying to choose a name for a character is who are my character's parents. In the real world, the parents are typically the ones who choose the name that their child receives, and it is both a very helpful exercise in fleshing out your character's backstory and a very good way to hone in on their name to try and think of the sorts of names that the character's parents would choose. This can be tricky when you're first starting to plot out a book if you don't really know who the character's parents are yet. You don't even really know who the character is yet. You're just trying to figure out what they'll be named. But it is pretty important to figure out who your character's parents are, especially if they feature in the book, especially because different parents will choose vastly different names for their children. Your character may have very conservative Christian parents who prefer more traditional names, or your character's parents might be free spirits and they might prefer more alternative names. Maybe your character is named after a relative and that relative features in the book, and that's a very prominent relationship for your character that has really shaped your character in some way. Maybe your character's parents are artists and they named their child after a famous artist. Going through this exercise really helps me see my characters as real people with lives that are broader than just my story premise. The third thing I consider when choosing a name for my character is personality. This one is a little bit trickier than the first two, because when you're creating a character, you're sort of doing it the opposite way, like you're doing it backwards from the way that people do it when they're naming a child. When somebody has a child and they're naming that child, they don't know who that child is going to end up being yet. They don't know what their personality is like. They don't know what that child is going to end up wanting, or whether they're going to like their name, or what they're going to be interested in, or just generally how they're going to be in the world. They just name that child, and then the child ends up becoming the person that they ultimately become. And then, of course, the child can go back and change their name, which is another consideration. When we create characters, we're usually not creating characters of babies. They're usually pretty fully fleshed out people by the time that we're writing books about them. And so we get to take this concept of a character and work backwards to figure out what their name would be. This allows us the opportunity to choose names that fit the character's personality. Now, I'm almost convinced that in real life, people who are named certain names ultimately end up really embodying those names in some way. Like, have you ever just met somebody and they tell you what their name is and you're like, oh yeah, you are an Ashley. Or like, oh yeah, you really are a John. When writing books, we can really do this intentionally. Some authors like to choose names that mean things that that character is or embodies in some way, like names that mean strong or true or loyal, or have those meanings that connect to some sort of attribute that the character has. This is especially fun when naming side characters if those attributes aren't things like strong or loyal and are instead more specific things like greedy or backstabbing or things like that that can foreshadow what is going on in the story. Or choose names that just sound like they embody that quality, like some sort of like meek kind of mouse-ish name. Like the one that's coming to mind is like Peter Pettigrew. Like that's kind of like a mousy name. I'm probably just saying that because of the rat thing, but it doesn't sound like a brave, like lion strong name. Pettigrew is like a name that fits that character more. So you can also name characters after personalities. Note that this is something to consider and should fit within the naming conventions that you've already structured through the setting identification and also you figuring out who the character's parents are. Like, don't figure out like, okay, this character is from Wyoming and comes from a more like traditional household, and the names that this character's parents would really like are things like Andrew and John, but their personality really fits the name Zygomantis. Try to find ones that fit within the naming conventions that you figured out in order to make your book feel the most grounded and real. But the fourth thing that I consider is names that I personally like. I am writing this book, and if I'm choosing a name for my main character, I will have to write this name over and over and over again and live with it in my head for a very long time. And so I don't want to choose a name that I personally hate for one of these characters. I don't really know how to describe it, but the vibe of the name has to be right. Even if it fits within the naming conventions, names have different vibes and feelings to them, and if the name just doesn't fit the character well, then it is an obstacle that I'm unable to overcome in my head, and it makes it really difficult for me to write about that character. So I do try to choose names that I like, that have good vibes, and vibes that fit with the essence of that character somehow. I don't exactly know what that is, but it's a feeling that I get, and because we as writers are artists, I have a feeling that you have an inner feeling like that too, and we'll be able to tell if a character's name feels right or not. And finally, the last thing that I consider is my cast as a whole. I don't want to have 4 character names in my main cast of characters that all start with the letter C. Chloe, Cora, Claire, and Cece are probably all going to be very confusing names to read about if those are the 4 best friends, because all of the names start with the letter C and they're going to all look similar on the page, and it's going to be hard for readers to immediately be able to differentiate between all of them. They technically are different names, but Chloe and Claire start with a C and end with an E, and it just looks a little too similar on the page to make the reading experience enjoyable for your readers. I try to make it a rule that no 2 main characters can have the same first initial in their names. I don't always meet this, but if 2 characters do have the first same initial, then the names have to be different. They have to be different lengths, and they can't be like 2 best friends in the story that interact together all the time. They have to be disconnected in some way. Like in my current series, I have a Miles and I have a Max, but both of those names sound different from each other, even though they both start with M, and the 2 of them don't overlap in the story very much at all. They're in different scenes, they don't really share any scenes together, and so because their names aren't together all the time, it's easier for readers to differentiate between them. This is just something I like to do to make it easier on readers to keep track of all of the characters. It's just a small act of kindness, because I know when I'm reading and there are a lot of names that sound very similar, I get really confused very easily, and it just takes a little too much brain power for me to keep everything straight. And I'm lazy and have TikTok brain and have roughly the same attention span as a goldfish, and so everything has to be very clear in order for me to get into the story. So those are the 5 things that I consider when choosing names for my characters. Now I'm going to run you through 3 different examples of characters that I've named, things that I did right, things that I did wrong, and why I ended up choosing their names. The first example is the main character of the most recent standalone paranormal thriller that I wrote, and that is Daphne. So this book is set in the US. It is set in Montana, but Daphne is not from there. She's from New York. So I wanted to have a name that sounded American, that sounded like it could realistically be from New York. But when I moved into the second consideration of her parents and what her parents would have named her, this is really what ended up deciding Daphne's character name for me. Daphne is kind of an alternative, edgy kid who likes like alt music and like screamo rock, and she likes dressing in all black, and she's kind of goth, and she really does think of herself as kind of like edgy, hip, and cool. And her mom is the polar opposite of that, and she's like very hippie, free spirit, loved, like, was a music festivals person, is like a vegan. She has an Instagram where she like talks about being vegan, and she meditates every day, and she has crystals, and she does healing and all of that energy kind of work. And so she's the opposite of Daphne in really most every way. So I didn't want to name Daphne something that was edgy. I wanted to name Daphne something that would contrast with her personality and be something that her mom would have chosen, which led me more to names like Willow or Melody or Robin or Rain, or those kind of more natural names. But in the story, they moved to Montana, and Daphne absolutely hates it there. And she just really hates nature for a big chunk of this book. And so I didn't want to choose anything natural because her mom's not really like a nature person. She likes like the energy of nature, but she's not outdoorsy. So I didn't want anything like rain or meadow. So it ended up being between Melody and Daphne. And I chose Daphne because I really like the name, because the vibe fit her character. Like, I could really see her as a Daphne. I also had never seen Scooby-Doo, and so I've been receiving feedback that I can't use the name Daphne because it is too strong of a Scooby-Doo correlation for a lot of people, but I've never seen Scooby-Doo, so I don't have that same connection in my mind. We'll see if I end up keeping it, but that was my thought process when I came around to the name of Daphne, and that's why I chose it. That's her name in my manuscript right now. We'll see if it stays that by the time I publish it, but that's how I chose that. The next example I have is the main character in my published series, which is Shiloh. I'm not going to call this a naming fail, but I picked Shiloh's name only because I liked the name. And that's why I wanted to talk about that in this video, because I chose her name and I named the main characters in this series before I really started using these considerations to help me narrow down my choices. I love the name Shiloh. There is no chance, and I'm saying like absolutely no chance, that in real life this girl would be named Shiloh. Her dad never would have agreed to name his daughter Shiloh. Her dad is like the most kind of like traditional American guy. He's the sheriff of their town, and he's also like not a good guy. He's very, very controlling and like abusive to his family, and what he wants happens. Her mom would have had no say in her name. It would have been what the dad wanted her to be named. He would have wanted something much more traditional and also more feminine, so he would have probably chosen something more like Sarah. Maybe Savannah, if that would be pushing it, but maybe Savannah. But I would guess more like Sarah. I don't dislike the name Sarah. I'm just so used to this character being named Shiloh that thinking of her named anything else feels weird to me. But if I were to do that again, that is probably what I would end up naming her. Something just a little bit more in line with what her parents would have named her, just to be more realistic and keep it more grounded in the world. And then the last name that I'll talk about is also another character in that same series, and that is Francesca. In my first draft of the series, Francesca's character was named Rochelle, and the story really is about Shiloh and Francesca going and like doing some sort of ghost adventure together. And so they were in a lot of scenes together, and I was getting some feedback that Rochelle sounded too much like Shiloh because it used the same sh sound, and so I had to change it to something. I had picked the name Rochelle just because I liked it. Like, there was a girl at this school that I volunteered at whose name was Rochelle, and I was like, that's such a pretty name. I love it, and it just really fit the character to me because she's just very soft-spoken and she's sweet, and it was just like a really beautiful, gentle name, and so I really liked it for that character. But I knew that I had to change it because I liked Shiloh's name more, and I didn't want to rename Shiloh. It would have been funny if it was like Sarah and Rochelle. Like, I can't even think about that at this point. Like, I've lived with them as Shiloh and Francesca for so long. but I knew that I had to change Rochelle's name. I knew the book was set in Ohio, but really the main consideration that I had was with family. And Francesca is Italian American, and Rochelle wasn't an Italian name. And so in that original draft, I was trying to justify that by being like, the mom really liked the name and she's American. And that was fine. Like for the story, like that would have been fine. But I figured since she was Italian American, I could find a name that I really liked that still had that really gentle, beautiful, but strong quality to it. And that is how I landed on Francesca. Not because it's a particularly popular name in Ohio, but because of the context around her family and where her family comes from. And so those all sounded different enough. Shiloh and Jonah sound just a little bit similar, but not so similar that I couldn't have both of them together. So that is how I ended up choosing that name. But that's all I got for this video on how to choose names for your contemporary book characters. I hope that it was interesting. If you have a character name that you have chosen for your books that you really like, that really fits the character, drop it in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you arrived on that name and whether you considered any of the things that I mentioned in this video. If you have a second, I'd be super grateful if you could like the video and also subscribe to my channel. My name is Claire Fraze, and I'm an award-winning author who makes videos sharing actionable writing tips that helped me make my own writing better. I'm the author of the 5-book paranormal thriller They Stay series, as well as my debut novel, which I published in high school, and many more that are not published or have not been published yet. I have a lot of really exciting projects that I'm gonna start working on very soon this year. I'm just putting the finishing touches on the last book in that 5-book series, and I am loving it. And that is going to be coming out soon, and then as soon as that is done, I will be moving on to some other big projects, which I am excited to start talking about on the channel. But yeah, like and subscribe. I'd be super, super grateful if you could. I hope you have a fantastic week, and as always, happy writing.